going shared with those people that can't make it. Okay, we'll kick this morning off. Thank you very much for those people who attended yesterday's session. We had a really full day, really busy. We had lots of people attending. We had some really great talks, and we recorded all of those. So if you weren't able to make those sessions yesterday, I will be sharing them sometime next week once we've had time to edit them and make sure that they're all share worthy, shall we say. So today we've got Jonathan Eaton from Teesside University giving us our keynotes for this morning. Jonathan is academic registrar over at Teesside University and has been very highly involved in their digital transformation, which no doubt he'll tell you the story of, but that there's a lot of investment and time and energy gone into building Teesside University's digital infrastructure and getting that rolled out across the students. And I'd also think it's worth mentioning that Jonathan's actually a published author, but not in a field that I would have expected. I'm just looking on Amazon here, and his new book, Leading the Roman Army, Soldiers and Emperors, 31 BC to 235 AD, sounds like a really interesting read, looking at the life of the Roman soldier and how the Roman army was managed. So perhaps at some point he might like to mention that as well. So Jonathan, without any further ado, I'll hand over to you now. So thank you very much.
Thank you. And when you've finished looking on the Amazon page, if you just click buy now, that would be good.
Okay.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's really appreciated. Can I just check it? Can everyone see the slides okay?
I can see them fine.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah. That's great. Thank you. Well, thank you again for that really kind introduction. It's tremendous to be here for a number of reasons, really. First of all, I'm really glad to participate in an event during the Love Our Colleges week, and also really pleased that Darlington College has been recognised within the EdTech demonstrator programme for all of the great work that's going on in the college. So even though I'm going to talk very much around the Teesside University context, I hope there's things that people can draw from the presentation for their own practice, but also that perhaps through the Q&A I can learn from other people's practice as well. And as Wayne said at the beginning, I'm the academic registrar at Teesside University. I've been there 4 years now, but before that I worked in FE. And continue to have very close working relationship with FE. I serve on a college board, and I'm also heavily involved in the Teesside University College Partnership, of which Darlington is, of course, one of our key partners as part of that. And I've really been enthused, really, over the past few months when I think the power and role of FE seems at last to have been recognised by government, and I think there's a real moment in the sun which is rightfully come in the way of FE, and I think digital transformation forms a key part of that. So what I'm going to do is really a game of two halves. I'm aiming to speak for about 40 minutes or so. The first part of the presentation is going to focus on the journey we've been on at Teesside, and really the initiatives that we've put in place over the last few years. The second part is probably the kind of lessons learned from that, and the things that actually I think are relevant to any institution, regardless of scale or size or place within the educational sector. And that's drawing on some of our learning from during the pandemic as well. So in terms of Teesside University, you'll notice I've picked here a nice autumnal picture, though clearly before the pandemic, because I don't think those students are actually fully socially distanced. But nevertheless, Teesside University has around 15,000 students typically on campus pre-pandemic, of course. Around 2/3 of our students are drawn from the northeast, and in fact it's much more localized than that, with a heavy concentration from across the Tees Valley. And that means that the predominant majority of our students are commuter students who are coming into the campus on a daily basis rather than living in halls necessarily. We have an increasing footprint across the United Kingdom, and we're tending to find that it's particular courses that attract students from across the UK, especially in our games and animation department. And over time, we've gradually increased the number of our international students as well, who are coming to the campus to enjoy a UK-based experience, particularly students from China, India, Malaysia, Southeast Asia, etc. And that, of course, has been particularly challenging as we've maintained and continued their studies during the pandemic. And that's something that perhaps I'll touch on. Now, Teesside itself, as many of you will be aware, has been on, well, I suppose, continues on a major transformation journey, of which digital has been at its heart. So what I'd like to do is just talk you through some of those initiatives and how this was put together at both a strategic level, but also at an operational level as well. So 2 years ago, we introduced our distinctive strategic approach to learning and teaching, which we call future-facing learning. And you'll see the logo in the top right-hand corner of the slides. But future-facing learning is essentially conceptualized through the structure you can see on the slide. And the reason we created future-facing learning is that we had a learning and teaching strategy from 2015. But when we took a good hard look at that, we realized that it was essentially functioning as a Word document, and it hadn't really been brought to life. And it was difficult for students and other external stakeholders to understand what we were trying to achieve at Teesside University. So we spent a period of time going through a consultation exercise with students, governors, stakeholders to understand what it is we do and what we're trying to achieve in terms of learning and teaching. And this led to the creation of future-facing learning as a framework. Now, the way this is put together is really simple. So around the perimeter, you can see 3 key themes. These are the underpinning themes, essentially things that we're good at already. We have an established heritage in, and that supports what we're trying to do in the future. So that means teaching excellence. We're obviously rated silver in the TEF. We have aspirations for gold, and it builds on our history and heritage as a teaching intensive university. Inspiring and enabling spaces are both those physical environments within the university, but also the digital environments we've been creating as well. And you'll see some of those during this presentation. The final one, of course, is 21st century curriculum design and delivery. And that's really drawing on our heritage as a polytechnic, and before that, a technical college, in terms of designing curricula which are absolutely aligned with the needs of industry and employers. Obviously, that's completely normal practice for colleges, but as you'll be aware, some universities perhaps aren't as lined up in that as we might hope. So these 3 underpinning factors then support the 5 core themes, which are future ready, socially and ethically engaged, research active, globally connected, and digitally empowered. And these are the themes which we aim to develop in our students through our learning and teaching. How they're developed depends on the specific nature of the course and the discipline. But what our intention is that when a student graduates, they go for an interview for graduate level employment and they're asked, why did you study at Teesside University? They're able to answer, because it made me future ready in X, Y, and Z ways, and it made me socially and ethically engaged in X, Y, and Z ways, etc. So this has provided a very clear institutional framework for what we aim to achieve. But we recognised at the outset that to deliver this transformation required a heavy focus and investment on our digital infrastructure. So we prioritised to begin with this theme of digital empowerment for both our staff and our students. And that's meant that we've been on this rapid change programme of introducing a series of new digital initiatives, all of which were designed to create a solid technology base for what we've tried to achieve through future-facing learning. So I'll just walk you very quickly through this, and then you understand the kind of tempo of change that we've been through, and also how this fits together. Because when you look at the slide there, it essentially looks like a series of technical projects, but in reality, there's a pace and a connectedness to this, which allows us to develop as an institution and really drive forward that learning and teaching agenda because of what the technology at each stage allows us to do that we couldn't do previously. So we started off in September 2017 with the MyTU student portal. You may well have seen this. It's essentially an app that students use. It's produced by a company called Collabco, and it uses a framework called MyDay. MyTU is essentially the one-stop shop. So students go to this app and they have access to their VLE, to their calendar, to their mail, to everything they need. The reason for introducing that is that we had a historic weakness in the NSS around organisation and management and communication to students. And that was because we had so many diverse channels of communication, the messages just weren't getting through. So we wanted one digital location for students to access. We then moved on to our module evaluation system, EVASYS, and colleagues who are working across the TUCP will be very aware of this because the module evaluation questionnaires that we produce are generated through this system. It's essentially an online system that allows us to evaluate every module across every course that's run by Teesside University. It's massively decreased in the localization of module evaluation, so it means we get a very quick institutional overview of how each module is performing according to student feedback. Before that, module evaluation was done at local levels and the data was never collated centrally. So we had a blind spot that we've now addressed. March 2018, we were one of the first UK universities, in fact, I think possibly the first, to introduce Microsoft Teams as a learning and teaching tool. I'll come on to some of the background to this because things have changed over the last 6 months, of course. But at the time, we got quite a lot of attention for doing that. And I'll explain a little bit of the rationale for it at that stage as well. We've then been on a major technology deployment program to staff through iPads for all teaching staff, which commenced in April 2018. And that was in advance of the student iPad deployment in September of the same year. In 2019, we brought in a new VLE for online distance learning. And last September, we introduced a new attendance recording tool, which essentially was a missing piece of our infrastructure. The way we were recording attendance was very paper-based. It was extremely burdensome. So we wanted to replace this with a much easier way using technology to record attendance accurately. That allowed us in January of this year, and really a really timely development, to introduce our learner analytics platform. And I'll pick this up later in the presentation because that's really allowed us to revolutionize how we use data appropriately to understand how our students learn. And the final piece that's going to drop in place next September will be our new campus-based VLE. And by that stage, we will have had all the foundation pieces in place for what the future of our digital learning looks like, both on the campus and online. So that really has been the journey we've been on in terms of projects. When we introduced future-facing learning, and we really began to evaluate what we would need in order to make this a success, we recognized a real challenge around access to technology amongst our students. And that meant hardware, software, but also access to broadband connectivity itself. So as you saw on the previous slide, in 2018, we introduced our advanced scheme. What the advanced scheme basically is a package for our students, which are given to full-time first-year undergraduates on their arrival. And it consists of an iPad, a keyboard, a suite of apps, which I'll come on to in a bit more detail, and £100 credit per year. That credit was originally for books, but we've recently expanded that, and I'll explain that in a bit more detail, to include purchasing mobile data and also other specialist digital equipment to inform learning and teaching. This has been a massive deployment. In fact, it was one of the largest iPad deployments in the UK university sector. And it was really a huge gamble as well, because it meant that in order to do that, we also had to establish a sound and solid and consistent technology base for our teaching staff as well. And therefore, we rolled out the same devices with appropriate training to all of our teaching staff in advance of the students receiving the iPads. To give you a sense of the scale of this academic year is the first one where every undergraduate year group has iPads, because of course it's taken 3 academic years 3 new intakes for this to flow all the way through the university. And that means at the moment we've got over 10,000 student iPads in circulation, alongside almost 1,000 staff iPads. And managing all of those devices is incredibly complex, as you can imagine, but it's given us a real step forward in addressing the digital divide and those digital poverty issues that have become so evident nationally during the pandemic. Now, I mentioned that we put together a consistent suite of apps on the devices for students and teaching staff, and this is that suite. We call it the Future Facing Learning Toolkit, so it's installed as default on student and staff devices, and in the terms and conditions, students are requested to keep these apps on their iPads and make sure that they're up to date. They can add any other apps they like within reason. So we know, for example, students download Netflix, etc. That's absolutely fine if it works for them, as long as they maintain access to these. Now, when we put the Future Facing Learning Toolkit together, there are a couple of considerations. First of all, we wanted a suite of apps that would support learning and teaching. And therefore, we started off with a set of learning and teaching activities and then identified the best apps that would support those. And we trialed and tested them with small groups of students and staff as well. You might notice that none of these apps are Apple specific, and that in itself was deliberate, because although we'd chosen the iPad as the key teaching device, we didn't want to be locked into Apple necessarily. And therefore, we chose a suite of apps that could be deployed on any device. And we make these available for students to download on laptops or their smartphones, etc. Now, at the heart of this, we put Microsoft Teams. And at the time, this was slightly controversial as to why we were doing it. And I remember kind of when we were briefing staff, we said, well, we've chosen Microsoft Teams because we've tested this quite thoroughly, and we believe this might be the future of how technology is used in business enterprise. And we think that many of our students, when they graduate, will go into businesses which will increasingly use Microsoft Teams. Of course, what we couldn't have predicted then, but we all know now, is that much of the world would move on to Microsoft Teams and very similar platforms as a result of the pandemic. So there's been a real acceleration there. And of course, the fact that our students have been using it for so long really positions them well for seeking employment. And that applies to the broader Office 365 suite as well. We tried to avoid in general apps which only have educational use, and we've only got a few of those, like Mendeley as an example. We wanted to provide apps which students would derive benefits from throughout their working lives, as well as their time as students. At the same time, we also started to look at our physical infrastructure, because we recognize that you can't change learning and teaching from a digital perspective if you're not also shaping the physical context in which they're learning. And we had a real opportunity that was presented to us accidentally, really. So there used to be a room in our Clarendon building, and some people might be familiar with it actually, which was an old PC lab. And it had about 50 PCs, in fact, more actually. Yeah, it would have been more, perhaps 80, let's say, row upon row. It was quite depressing when you walked into that room. You just saw this is a very traditional pedagogy, no longer fit for purpose. And our estates team came to us and said they wanted to do something with this room. They weren't sure what, but they would be open to ideas if we could bring them forward. And they were very keen to do something completely different. So we worked with a team of architects, and we basically said to them that when you go into schools and colleges and universities and you're shown an innovative classroom or classroom of the future, it's always still a classroom. You still know it's a classroom when you walk into the room. And that's often because it has to have certain things. There's often a focal point where the teacher will stand to impart knowledge. The desks will all be pointed usually in the same way, etc., etc. So instead, we wanted to create a new digital classroom which would really energize some of the key themes that we've been developing in future-facing learning, particularly thinking about connectivity and how students collaborate together. So we created this room, which is the digital classroom. And as you can see, it's essentially created for that collaborative group working. So as you can see from this photo, there isn't really a focal point in the room. Instead, students work in small, flexible groups. They connect their devices up to the screen, and the lecturer, through their device, can switch between screens so that people are able to see what other groups are doing. The furniture, you'll notice, in the most part, is highly flexible so that people can shift up, they can change gears, they can change groups, etc. But you'll also notice as well the whiteboards, which very helpfully say right here along the top. And that was very deliberate because we wanted to make a statement that digital can't solve everything, and manual tools still have a really important place. And it's really great that when you're in this room, but also when you go into the library, where we've taken a very similar approach, you can see students working on the whiteboards and often doing really complex diagrams, because that works better for them than doing it through a device. So that was the second key part in terms of digital infrastructure. But of course, the third element was around our staff and how we develop them to use the technology to drive improvements in learning and teaching. It's always interesting, isn't it? You know, during this pandemic, when you see pictures of people sitting closely together, given that, you know, we're in a world where that no longer quite exists at the moment, it's always quite strange. So what we tried to do was to introduce a comprehensive and mandatory development program for teaching staff. And I've emphasized the word mandatory there because although it's common in other elements of the educational sector, it's quite unusual to put on mandatory sessions in universities. But we recognize that the only way for this to succeed if it's done at scale and everyone buys into it. And we started that process well in advance of the student iPad deployment. And we think that has been one of the success factors in what we've done. Looking at other universities, the conversations we've had with them, sometimes the timing is out of sync so that students are getting devices at the same time as staff. And that doesn't work because the staff aren't prepared. They don't have confidence to engage with it. So we pushed forward with this major digital development program, and so far I'm pleased to say 700 staff have been through the program. We used the JISC digital capability tool to assess the progress that staff made going through that, and we also mapped it to the Microsoft Innovative Educator Award. So as staff members went through the program, they were gathering points and they could apply for accreditation from Microsoft, given the centrality of Office 365 to that. Obviously, we asked for feedback from staff, and 95.5% of participants have been satisfied with the program, which, given that this is a mandatory initiative, we think is pretty impressive overall. It's a 6-hour program, which is delivered in a number of different ways. So it can be a full day session, can be 2 half days, can be a series of hour-long sessions. We make it as flexible as possible so staff are able to engage with it. In terms of students, we've seen really positive outcomes there as well. So I mentioned the module evaluation surveys that take place every semester across every module. We inserted a specific question in there, which would only be visible to students who were eligible for the advanced scheme, so had the iPad, the toolkit. And we asked them around whether they've had opportunities to use the toolkit and the iPad to enhance their learning. As you'll see here, we've had some really positive results from that. So in the first year, it was 85.4% of students at levels 3 and 4. In 2019, it was 86%. Obviously, later in November, we'll be seeing what the 2020 result looks like. And that in itself is going to be fascinating, given how much change has gone on over the last 12 months. So a very, very positive feedback from students. We've also had anecdotal feedback from individuals around how this has been useful in a number of different ways. So a number of dyslexic students, for example, have said that this has been a real game changer for how they're able to access and manipulate PowerPoints, as an example, within lectures. We also know that simply having the device, a dedicated device for learning, is helpful for many of our students where they might have busy home lives and they might have a laptop, but actually the kids need that to do the homework or to watch Netflix, etc. So there's a number of different benefits which we've seen accrue during this project. And we're about to do a major evaluation of the first 3 years and the impact that it's had. Of course, physically, it's been a game changer in terms of how we're seeing students engaging with it. And it's particularly great in times past, kind of wandering around the library. And this was an example of a tweet that was put out by one of our social media accounts where they'd spotted a group of students working on their iPads and kind of gone over to them and said, oh, you know, what are you using it for? In this case, it was a group of mechanical engineers who were working together on a group presentation. And obviously, as we've gone into the pandemic, the access to these devices has been critical because of that sound and solid technology base that our students have access to. And staff feedback has been positive as well. It's worth saying that although the mandatory training program was in place, we haven't mandated the use of the technology. So the perspective that we've always taken on this is to say to staff, this is a suite of apps, and we're going to show you how these apps can be used. But how you choose to use them is entirely up to you because it's so specific according to a particular discipline, a particular degree course. And we've been very careful to get that messaging right, because the last thing we would want to do is to enforce the use of technology, because that's just not going to work at all. And the feedback from staff, as I mentioned, has been positive. These were some of the quotes from the evaluation last year around the toolkit becoming the modus operandi of the university and Teams itself becoming a killer app in different ways in the school. What we noticed very quickly is that although our focus was on teaching staff, we saw kind of organic growth in the use of Teams, in particular for being used for cross-university projects and bringing together staff from different schools and departments who wouldn't normally necessarily be able to interact. So we saw significant growth just when we get started with this and when people understood what the sense of direction was. So that's all going very well. And then, of course, the world changed and we went into the pandemic. And I think this has been a huge learning curve, of course, for every institution around learning and teaching, what the future of that looks like, and the efficacy of digital tools for supporting learning and teaching. What I'd like to do with the rest of the presentation is really talk you through some reflections, I suppose, on what we've done so far and how that prepared us for the pandemic, and then what we've learnt over the last 6 to 7 months as we've gone through the pandemic itself and the impacts on the institution. The way I'd like to do that is to wrap it around a bit of a change model. It's Cotter's change model, which has been integral to what we've been trying to achieve, and perhaps give you a bit of narrative on what's worked really well, where there's still work to do overall, and some of the kind of quick wins that we've had that I think could be applicable to any institution, regardless of size or scale. Establishing a sense of urgency is absolutely key to this. And we tried to do that at the outset when we introduced future-facing learning, the recognition that our students expected more of us in how they would use technology. And we recognised that when we were scoping out this project across the sector, there was fantastic work going on in colleges, high schools, primary schools, perhaps less so in general in universities. And we saw that there was an emerging educational gap in how technology informs learning, which is only going to become more severe as time goes on. So that's how we initially established a sense of urgency. But of course, into the pandemic itself, well, there was a natural sense of urgency in terms of how we sustain that delivery of learning and teaching. And recognising, of course, that many of our traditional modes of delivery, i.e. a large lecture theatre like this that could hold up to 100 students for some of the larger lectures, just wasn't going to be practical for the duration of the pandemic. So, as many of you will be aware, if you put in place social distancing restrictions at the 2-metre rule across a lecture theatre that could hold, say, 120 students, you end up with it being able to hold less than 10. So we recognised this very quickly, and we began to put plans in place in early February when we began increasingly to become concerned of what was happening in terms of the spread of the pandemic in China, and therefore really upped our game in terms of business continuity planning. And there was a couple of things we did at that stage that I think have been pivotal. So we put out in early February a survey for teaching staff, which was essentially checking their access to technology off campus. So whether they had a device, whether they had their software up to date, whether they had any connectivity issues. And of course, there were some staff who live in highly remote locations out in the Yorkshire Dales, etc., for whom internet access can be challenging. And therefore, we were able to make some quick steps at that stage, in some instances reallocating modules, in other cases making sure people were given devices or knew how to use software in advance. So that put us in quite a good place. We'd also done the mapping exercise already to understand actually what would be the reduced capacity on campus if we had to significantly reduce the number of students. This, of course, was pre-national lockdown when we thought we might have to take some initial steps. But obviously, going into the pandemic itself and the lockdown, the key priority was to sustain learning. It meant for us there were about 3 weeks of teaching left that needed to be moved online. And then we had to consider our assessment approaches as well, and work very closely with course teams to begin to pivot those into online models. And colleagues across the TUCP who've been delivering on Teesside University courses will have been involved in that process as well. That meant we learned very rapidly around what seemed to work, what didn't, and how we need to put responses in place very, very quickly. The second phase is then around building a powerful guiding coalition. And that really means bringing together the key stakeholders in this space and ensuring that there is unity of purpose and sense of direction. Now, this has always been key to what we've been trying to achieve in terms of digital transformation. And for me, it's really characterized by this image. So this image are members of our IT department at one of our first boot camps that we ran for teaching staff in terms of digital development in 2018. And what was so exciting about this image for me is it demonstrates that what we were able to do at that stage was bring together the IT department with learning and teaching. And that meant we had a cohesive approach in what we were trying to achieve, both in what was happening within the classroom, but also the technology infrastructure that was supporting that. And that's continued to this day. And it's been increasingly important during the pandemic, of course, where so much of our teaching is reliant upon the stability of the platforms we use. And when there are, for example, global issues with how particular pieces of software work, that needs to be communicated very swiftly and very effectively out to our teaching staff. But it's also making sure that our IT department understand the criticality of this and how teaching staff use the tools and expect those tools to work to maintain a good student experience. So that close working has been really, really significant. And whenever we've had conversations with other universities, we've always emphasized the centrality of that in terms of close working so that everyone understands what it is institutionally we're trying to achieve. Now, you've got the coalition, you've established a sense of urgency, but you then need to coalesce people around that central vision. Back in 2018, when we started that journey, the vision was around future-facing learning. Now, it's also about future-facing learning, but most significantly, it's around our hybrid delivery model, which essentially is how we're delivering learning and teaching this academic year. It's a combination of on-campus delivery and online delivery. On campus, it equates to an average of 4 hours per week for each full-time student, 2 hours a week for part-time students, with the rest of delivery accomplished online. That's meant we've been able to safely maintain the number of students on campus and making sure they get the benefits of both worlds in terms of physical interaction, but also online. That hybrid model has been the vision around which all of our stakeholders have begun to coalesce. And it's meant, of course, that the technology base that we've established around iPads has been critical, because we've been able to recognize that our staff and students have that common denominator. But of course, it's also exposed some of the weaknesses. I think every institution in the country is grappling with these challenges around the digital divide and what we mean by digital poverty. For us, it's been around students who didn't have stable internet access, but also those who didn't have study space at home, i.e. their home conditions meant that actually they didn't have space to sit and study, or perhaps there was limited technology in the house and that had to be directed to skilled children who were learning remotely for most of the day. So we're continuing to grapple with those issues. We're continuing to put steps in place to address them. But the hybrid model is what we're trying to drive forward and make sure that we deploy our resources appropriately. Now, we've crafted the vision. The next step is how we communicate that vision. And we've done so extremely aggressively, by which I mean we've, in a sense, over-communicated what we've tried to achieve, because we recognize that communication in a complex organization is always a challenge. It's even more of a challenge when the majority of staff are working remotely, as are our students. So we established a single point of call, which is LTE Online. That's the one-stop shop which the university has for all learning and teaching resources. It's open access. If you just search for LTE Online, you'll find it. It's essentially a WordPress site which we've developed over the last couple of years, but we really radically transformed as we went into the hybrid model to make sure that we were updating on a daily basis as issues emerge. So, for example, at the start of this term, we had feedback from staff that running group work is quite challenging within a socially distanced classroom. So we put together guidance, which we passed out very quickly and published on LTE Online, which talking through how you can use technology to enable that whilst maintaining safe distances between both staff and students. And of course, we'll continue on that journey in terms of how we move our development for staff online. And it's really been a bit of an accelerator for that. And it's raising a question around when so much of our professional development for staff was delivered physically, we can do a lot more, I think, in future online. And that means that the time we spend physically in a face-to-face contact with staff is all about added value beyond the things that they could pick up through a self-paced course or an online event such as this today. When we started on our digital transformation journey and we talked around what the indicators of success would be, we said that innovation would be an output rather than an input of the project, that we would recognize that staff have developed confidence to use tools in new ways that we hadn't conceived of, and that this would feed into learning and teaching and really generate some outstanding results in terms of impact that we couldn't envisage at the beginning, nor did we intend to plan into. And that's been absolutely true. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that in some of the later slides. So it's all been about empowering staff and students to drive this forward, recognizing that the institutional framework is about setting a sense of direction, but then how staff choose to use those tools and how our students choose to guide us on what we should be doing next has been absolutely critical to that. And there's been a number of examples of how staff have used this in new ways. I think this year in particular, it's becoming apparent the impact that this has had on assessment methods, and a really good hard look at traditional assessment methods, which are no longer fit for purpose under social distancing, which raises a question of whether we should be continuing those approaches in the years to come, or whether this allows us to completely rethink what we've been trying to achieve. It's really important, of course, that we recognize quick wins, particularly in terms of innovation, to demonstrate to staff who are often working under very challenging conditions, they're adapting, they're learning and teaching very quickly, that this can be done and it can generate new and innovative methods which we hadn't previously conceived. This is one of my favourite examples, which actually was created for induction this academic year. So it's very, very recent, where a group of our staff got together to look at Minecraft. And you'll recognise, of course, that the Future-Facing Learning Toolkit doesn't include Minecraft. And this is an example of staff going above and beyond. They've recognised that there are tools which they can use and which we can deploy to students through the iPads, which offer new experiences to our students. So obviously this academic year, many of our students can't actually come onto campus. That may be due to medical considerations. It could be to do with travel restrictions as well. But we didn't want them to lose out on the on-campus experience. We also wanted to demystify in a way what the campus is like when we've got so many safeguards in place. So a staff team in our School of Health and Life Sciences have built our campus on Minecraft. For those of you who know the campus, the one on the left, that's our campus heart. So you're looking at the living wall of the business school. And beyond that, in the distance, you can see the tower block where I work, which is in the background of that first image in the presentation, the autumnal one. On the right, the team has stood in front of the curve. And this has really been built out over time. And what it means is that students can go onto Minecraft and they can roam about the buildings on campus, so they understand which building is for what purpose. But also they're set team tasks. So they work together as a team with students they've never met before. And in fact, it might be some time before they meet face to face to retrieve things, to do treasure hunts, etc. So they're learning about the campus, but they're also learning about their student community. And I think this is a great example of innovation which was never designed in, but actually has had a really fantastic impact in terms of the student experience. Now we've got the campus based in Minecraft. What we are able to do through that environment can grow exponentially. So we're looking at things like, well, could you do library tours through Minecraft of the library building as an example, etc. So huge opportunities here moving forward. Of course, as we go through these choppy and uncharted waters, we're learning so much about what's working well, but also what we need to change. And I think a key thing for all institutions is how rapidly we can learn and change in terms of how things are operating for students during the pandemic. I mentioned at the very outset that we introduced at the beginning of this year our new learner analytics platform, Stream. What Stream does is pull together existing data points on our students, and it doesn't collect anything new, and that's important. It's information which we already had in our systems. It had just never been joined up before. And it basically consists of VLE logins and VLE activity, card swipes when students are going in and out of buildings, attendance data, printing data, computer logins and Active Directory logins, and electronic library loans as well. All of that data is pulled together and it's presented in a dashboard to personal tutors and, importantly, students themselves. So there is nothing that we do on the platform which students don't have access to, and that's important in terms of transparency. What that means is that our personal tutors have really accurate insight into how our students are engaging, so that when they have tutorials, they're able to talk in a great deal of depth around understanding how students are choosing to engage with their studies. That's really come into its own during the pandemic, where we've had to focus a lot more on how students are engaging off campus. Stream becomes the platform for understanding that, but it also means we can make rapid online deferrals. So, for example, if a student presents with let's say a need for counselling, we're able to recognise that through the personal tutor and then refer them directly through the platform to one of our counselling team, who's then able to review the student record and see the same engagement data and can add comments there, as can the student themselves. So this has been a real game changer in terms of the personalisation of the learning experience, and something that we're really aiming to develop further over the years to come. Finally, it's about that scaling up. It's recognizing what's happening locally on the ground and being able to scale it very quickly across the whole institution. And what we've aimed to do in terms of our digital transformation is to have both that strategic context and framework, but also to build in mechanisms to scale quickly, recognizing that the innovation will come primarily at the interface between staff and students. A great example of this is our new student life building. If you haven't been on our campus this calendar year, you probably won't have gone into this yet because it opened just 6 weeks before national lockdown, unfortunately. But you might recall last year there was a building site in the middle of our campus, and it was creating this. So our student life building is the one-stop shop for student services. If a student has a problem, this is the place to go. And we've switched around many of our services so that they're located within this building. Obviously, that worked great for the first 6 weeks, but then the building itself shut down. And we've had to move very quickly to move a lot of those services online to make sure there's an equivalent offer. And it's a great example of how we've scaled online, but also picked up some of the requirements that have come in locally around the need for more counselling services, etc., that we've also managed to scale up. We need to do more of this in the future, and we need to strengthen our mechanisms that allow us to do this and make sure that we're able to understand what's working effectively on the ground and reduce the timescale for making that available more broadly across our entire student body. But certainly there's real seeds of hope there. I'm going to finish really with my philosophy, I suppose, but it's not my philosophy. It's Steve Jobs's philosophy in what we've been trying to achieve. I said at the outset that we hadn't mandated the use of technology in learning and teaching, and we continue not to do that. We want students and staff to innovate, to find new ways of doing things, and then for us to be able to pick up on that and make that innovation available more broadly. Steve Jobs said technology is nothing. What's important is that you have faith in people, that they're basically good and smart, and if you give them tools, they'll do wonderful things with them. I'm really looking forward over the years to come to understand the wonderful things that colleagues at Teesside, at Darlington, and at all the institutions that are represented here today will continue to do with digital tools to deliver an outstanding experience for all of our students. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Those are my contact details if you ever want to reach out to me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Really, really informative. That's really informative about your journey that you've taken there. I just want to pick up on a couple of issues and maybe you could expand on them a little bit. You talk a lot about community building and communication and the added value that brings. How do you deal with those people in any change management situation? You've always going to have your early adopters, but you've also going to have a fair percentage of the laggards. How do you deal with bringing those on board?
Yeah, really good question. What I'm going to say is the honest truth, and well, you'd expect me to say that, but I say that at the outset because what I'm going to say is quite bizarre. Obviously, when we went into this, we'd built that mandatory training program. We knew we had to take through 700 staff members who would have an incredible range of digital capability, from researchers at the cutting edge of quantum computing to people who were literally very anxious to turn a PC on. We faced no resistance. We faced no challenge from staff. Even though we thought that this would inevitably happen because of that. I think the reason for that and the way we were able to address it was the way we managed the comms on this. So that point out, in fact, the slide I showed at the end, the Steve Jobs one, was actually the final slide of the briefing that we gave to staff in advance of all of this. And we made very clear that the training itself is mandatory because we want to open your eyes to the tools that we have available. How you use them is up to you. We just want to know what works when you do begin to use them. But we're absolutely not forcing this on people. We also structured that training program very carefully. So the slide I showed of the digital classroom, before that was used for teaching, that was where we did the development program. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we did there was, first of all, we actually covered all the windows so you can't see into it. And the reason for that is it's a place for failure. So it's a place for people to come in, mess things up massively, and that's okay. No one's going to notice, and we'll help you to fix it. We also increased the staff who were supporting that program. So we usually had 3 people in the room for 20 staff maximum, which meant that those individuals who really struggled with things had individual support, as well as those who were more confident were able to get on with things themselves. So that's how we managed it. Perhaps more by accident than design, we were successful in how we did that.
I'm sure there's a lot of design in there. I'm sure there was. Thank you very much. Anybody else got any questions before we let Jonathan get on with what I can imagine is still a very busy day? No. Okay, can I just thank you again, Jonathan? That was really, really insightful. I really enjoyed that session. And thank you very much for taking the time out to deliver today's keynote. We've got people from all over the country who listened to that, and we've got others who haven't been able to make it, who've already asked, can we send the recording on to? So thank you very much for that, and no doubt our paths will cross again very soon, and hopefully in a few months' time we'll be able to shake hands again.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great. I hope the rest of the day goes really well. Take care, everyone. Stay safe. Speak soon.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Bye-bye.